Hello and welcome to Everchosen Minis. Today we're going to be working on a special project. Now the last video we came out with went over on how to paint these specific Necrons, and I mentioned that this would be a really fast and efficient way to paint them. So I thought I'd kind of put that to the test, and we are going to be painting an entire 2,000 point Necron army in just about 15 hours total. Now this is with several caveats that I took into account. So some of these models are secondhand and were pre-painted to a certain point. I'll show you later in the video exactly what stages everything that we're starting with is in, and I added the time to the 15 to account for some of these. This includes me making the bases off screen, some of these already being somewhat started, being primed with metallic paint. Some of them had washes. Not that we particularly need them for our project, and you'll see several without these steps that we just knock out super fast. So this project is in fact really easy. You see the channels where you do an entire army in 24 hours. Is it possible? Is it not? With this paint scheme, it's definitely possible. Now I broke this up over 2 days. I did a 5-hour day and I did a 10-hour day over the weekend. So if you break it up like that, this is a super digestible project. If you're a Necron player who's been trying to find a way to paint their Necron army for some time, if you just spare a weekend, I promise this will do just the trick. Now, I'm also going to go over several concepts and ideas behind army painting. This will probably be my 10th army, maybe even more that I've painted. So I have a lot of tips, tricks to kind of help you get through it. For me, I think of the army as a whole, how best to make it, stand out and just knock it out. So we'll go ahead and pop in. We have a few videos where I'm just kind of filming the process. We'll go over that. We'll have some of the steps in the background. I'm not going to go into too much detail on how to paint it since we made a whole video for that, but I will be kind of covering the broad strokes of the project and how you may want to organize some of these. Alrighty, here is what we are working with for this project. Right now, this is 2,000 point list of Necrons in front of me that I plan to have finished in an entire day. So let's go ahead and walk through some of the paints we're going to be using. These are the exact ones I'm using, but these are substitutable for the recipe. This is a 50-50 mix of Citadel's Contrast Black and Beowulf Blue speed paint. So if you want to recreate this exactly, just add this with a few drops of Contrast Medium and you'll be good to go. And then we have some of our Pro Acryl paints that we used, the pigment powder that we're going to be utilizing here, the ink, and then Ryza Rust, which we primarily used on the bases here. So let's go ahead and get this out of the way. Alright, and then of course the chrome markers that are going to be the key to our success here. Now this list is kind of already in disarray, and we'll go over some of the reasons why, and of course kind of their state. So this army I originally got secondhand, so a lot of it was already painted, and it was painted in various stages, as you can see here, different tones of metal, wash, no wash, just Necron army. And I think a lot of people get their secondhand Necrons kind of looking like this. So the units we're going to be painting are going to be these Scarab Swarms here. Got 9 of them. This is 30 Necron Warriors in various stages here, which will add a little variety once we're done with our work on them. We have a unit of 5 Death Marks, 2 singular units of Destroyers, our HQ choices. This one here is a bit of a kit bash for the guy leading the Wraiths, but then we got 2 Wardens and of course the Nightbringer on his big, glorious, goofy, small base. And then we have our Spider, 2 Doomstalkers, our Reanimator, a unit of 6 Wraiths in various degrees of condition. We have this guy who's not looking so good, missing some limbs. I did have this army for a while. I experimented a little bit. So we have this, which is pretty much done, but needs a little bit of work on the glow. we have him, who is also chrome the way we want it, but I chose to try out red, so he's going to need to be repainted a bit. So no big deal there. So I did make a video earlier that you can watch on how I did the scheme. So we're not going to go too much in detail this video on painting them. You are going to see time lapses of it, as that's part of the challenge. But it's mostly going to focus on the challenge of it and kind of my thought process and some tips and tricks on army painting. Now, this is our finished section, so we do actually have a little bit of a head start on this project. That might be cheating a little bit, but I think it's fine. These actually paint up super quick, so I can try to add the time it took to actually paint these on top of our time that we take to paint the rest, and we can go from there. Now, depending on what basing style you go with, can change a lot of the time. So I'll add my basing time at the very end, but just so you know, that has already been done. I have a big pile of bases to put everyone on once they're done, so those are ready to go. So that's the idea, that's the project. We have all this to paint in one day, and then we're gonna plop them on their bases and call it done. And then we'll just move on to that part here in a little bit. Okay, progress report time. So, the whole army now has been chromed. Everyone has gotten their spread on. So, this took about 4 hours to do. This is the most time-consuming part of this whole process. And so, what we need to do now is we are going to take all of them off of their original bases here, put them on our pre-prepped ones that we did, and then that way we can just finish up the process. So it shouldn't be too much longer. We're just going to be using this pigment powder here, water it down so that we can put this on their joints and whatnot to get them weathered, and then we will do our glowing effects to the airbrush, which will just be white with these inks, and that will finish them. So this is still looking to be about a 8 to 10 hour challenge to get this entire force done. I think we're well on track for that. But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and get the camera set up, get everything going, and then we will start that process. So now that all the chrome was done for this project, what we are kind of accounting for here, what I pre-prepped was the bases. Now, we lose a little bit of time that we saved by doing the bases separately. It's a lot easier to do the bases that I did just while they're very flat, because the process for them was just a lot of dry brushing on colors on top of each other. So whenever you have little Necron feet in the way, it makes that whole process slow down quite a bit, and it's harder to do. Now, because all of our Necrons that we got, I think came from the Indominus box, they all have little pegs that needed to be clipped, and they needed to be popped off their bases and re-glued on before we started the rest of the project weathering. So that whole thing for the whole army um, probably only took like half an hour to an hour to actually pop them all off and put them back onto the new bases. If you were to use a really popular texture paste, they have a red Mars one. It's similar to the one I use, it's just not as orange, and you still might have to dry brush it. But that paste you could put on to these Necrons without having to pop them off. And so your basing would go probably, from the 2 hours it took me to pop off mine and do the bases all together, to maybe even just like 45 minutes. And even less even if you're really fast about it and you don't dry brush stuff on top of it. So your basing that you want for your army can take a variety of times. Army projects can go from taking a day to several days depending on how complicated you want your basing to be and what schemes you want to do. So this one's the most ambiguous advice. Um, but just try to think ahead on the basing, whether it's easier to do your models already on the bases, or if the bases are easier to put together before or after doing the models, so that you can just apply them, because that can sometimes save you hours of work and tedium if you can just batch paint the bases by themselves, especially if they're a wholly different color than the models, and then you just attach them later. So for basing, definitely keep that in mind on what order you do it in, and where you want to save your time there. So after they're all attached to the bases, we can move on to the weathering, and that'll be our next step. Now, weathering in army projects can be some of the most fun that I've had painting, and that's just because you get to kind of make everything come out in detail a little bit, and you get to add a little nuance to your army. The Imperial Fist that we have several videos on the channel for use an oil paint. It is a pleasure to use. It flows everywhere very nicely, and you can really grunge up some models and give them a lot of character with the way that you apply it. These Necrons, same thing. You can weather it, but unlike the Imperial Fist, it's just one step. So, depending on how much you do, will save you a lot of time on your army projects. With the Imperial Fist, it's several stages of chipping with a sponge between metallic, black, and then putting a whole wash on it. And that takes time, especially if I were to do an entire army painting for the Imperial Fist. That step would take hours upon hours to do, especially since with the sponge work, you have to apply it in specific areas. Now, whenever you are doing your weathering for armies, that's something you have to keep in mind. The more complex you make your weathering, the more steps you need to add, the longer and longer time you get. And sometimes it's really worth it. If I had to do a whole army for Imperial Fist, I would say it's worth it because of the level of detail I want to be chipped on that armor. But for these Necrons and for several other factions, you can save a lot of time on weathering. All the weathering is done in one step, and it's just watered down pigment powder. When you apply it, as I mentioned in the Necron video before, the chrome paint is hydrostatic, so it does not want to be on there, and where it pools is typically the little chinks in the armor that Games Workshop sculpted for you to begin with, and then it just flows in between the joints and everywhere where dust would naturally collect. So in a way, this one step is kind of your end all be all. And I do the same thing with my orcs. I do the pigment powder on black armor, and then I dry brush silver. That's just 2 steps instead of one. So you kind of get a gradient. You get the Necrons where you just do one weathering step, saves you so much time. And certain other factions with like monochromed armor can utilize this as well. You could just do one weathering step if you want to just really beat up Space Marines. This works. But then you do orcs where it's like, I don't like highlighting black. So my solution is to get the recesses with dirt and grime that is the kind of the pigment powder and such, and then you dry brush silver on it to make it look worn. And so just a combination of these steps and depending on the look you want to achieve for an entire army um, is going to be a lot of fun, and it's going to really make your army come together. Just the chrome on a bunch of different colored metals, it looks a little hodgepodge and it's not that great. But when you get the contrast from weathering it, it really does take these models to the next step. And looking at it, it makes a lot of sense. So that's the steps that we took here. The process took probably about 2 hours to do every single model with this, and it sounds like a lot of time, but it's really not considering how many points we're doing and the total of this project. And so now that the weathering is done, we can focus our attention on the smaller details, and I'll go into kind of what to um, conceptually tackle for multiple armies, and then specifically how the Necrons here handled that. Alright, so when tackling details on an army, it can often be really daunting depending on the faction you have. Now, the Necrons here are not a exceptional example of painting details because they're all really, really bare bones. But there are some examples here that I can show off um, that you can really just kind of cut corners on for army painting. If you're looking at the army as a whole, um, it looks amazing. And for army painting, you kind of have to forfeit usually that not every model can be a character model. You can't just throw like multiple hours into each individual model, typically, depending on the quality you're going for. But if you're like me and you have a certain threshold where you want it fast, you want it efficient, you need to see, your effort bearing fruit consistently, but also looking good. These are kind of the corners you need to cut. So for Space Marines, this is pouches. Um, for chaos, maybe certain skulls, bones that you find here and there. There's a plethora of other examples. Now, I'm not saying not to paint these, but you don't need to do multiple passes. For a lot of my Space Marines, for my Chaos, I'll do one pass of a color and then let the weathering like a wash or the pigment powder take care of the rest. So for Space Marines, I just do one kind of brown on all the pouches and let the weathering kind of give it some recessed shading and call it done. Because the focal point isn't the pouches. The focal point for me on a lot of these are like the yellow armor for chaos. If there's like a small skeleton bone on his belt, make it white, let the weathering do the rest. You don't need to come back necessarily and highlight that for every single Marine, especially if you've conceptually given a different type of focal point to your army that makes it stand out. We did a video for Night Lords, and that saves you a lot of details because you're just focusing on highlighting everything with the same colors. There's nothing stand out or different about the Night Lords necessarily, but the army itself as a whole sticks out because of the lighting. So you can go back, see that video, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about there. But back to kind of cutting corners for the Necrons, a lot of them have kind of guts right underneath their rib cages. It's cables hanging out. Um, and you could go through and paint different colored cables, stuff like that. But they're kind of perfect at it. A lot of them have ridges and they catch the pigment powder really well. And, they weather themselves and they still look good without having to put a bunch of extra detail in there. Now, a few details that we did bother to change in this project were just with a few HQ choices. And with Necrons, there's not a lot of HQs, but the ones that they do have typically have some gold trim. Now, this is usually on their chest. They get like a little fancy necklace looking thing and sometimes some hanging tassels. So I just made those gold to show off their importance, and it makes them stand out just enough that you know that they're HQs. These wardens that we painted, they're basically just like little fancier Necron warriors. So it's harder for them to stand out without that color swap. So when you're doing your armies, your HQs, you do want to spend a little bit more time on. With Necrons, in the way we did this, it's harder to spend that extra time because they're not incredibly different. But for like a Space Marine captain or war boss, you know, uh, your leader elf for your Eldar, you can afford to spend a little bit more time on them, pick out more of their details. But a color change or an add of color is a really good way to do that. I know they're not characters, but like my Terminators for my Imperial Fist, they are a more elite unit. I gave them red helmets. So little things you can do um, to make your army stand out, but also cutting back time on details is a sweet spot that you'll learn to manage over time, especially with army painting. So you can cut out some of the small details that people aren't going to pay attention to and notice, but for the characters, make them stand out a little bit. And that's going to give kind of a fake level of detail to your army, where you're cutting corners other places so that you can put just a little bit of extra time in a few places where it makes sense. So when you get to these details, that's kind of my advice for breaking it down and getting the most bang for your buck as far as time and effort invested. Now, with these Necrons, they are a little bit special in the sense that they almost have two focal points for the army as a whole when you look at them. So, Necrons are kind of known for two things. They're almost all metallic robots, and they typically have a really awesome glowing effect that you see on all the armies. Now, the color changes depending on who wants to paint them, what dynasty you're going for. But in general, you always see Necrons with big glowing lasers. They have a ton of orbs and places that are really designed to be glowing. So that's another focal point. So not only have we put the effort and time into cultivating this chrome, making it stand out with a really unique metal, but the whole army needs to glow a little bit. Now, I wanted a green glow. That's the most traditional Necron glow, and it works really well because the Mars bases are red. And this is another thing you can do when you're considering your army painting as a whole, is thinking of ways to contrast your base. Now, the bases themselves are bright red, and then you kind of go into some darker in-betweens with the bright metal. But what stands out most is green is the complementary color to red. So if you pair that with the red, you just get this really nice contrast and they complement each other so well. So that's one reason we chose the green here. And I wanted a really saturated green. So there's a few ways to do this, and it takes a few steps. So whenever I said cutting corners, by picking a step that doesn't take as many layers to get it where you want it. Um, the glow is the exception. We did do several layers to make this stand out the way that we wanted it to in the end here. So whenever you're applying this to your other armies, not all of them will have a secondary focus. For Space Marines, for example, it's usually their main body is the show. Some of their heraldry, like purity seals and stuff, are good little minor details. But aside from like them being different color power armor, there's not too many things that make them stand out. Occasionally you'll get a captain with a power sword, which is probably the most applicable example, but usually that's not army wide. So unless you have certain patterns, or if you do like a OSL effect from like the Night Lords, where it's very clearly everyone is over like a glowing source of light, then you might be able to skip this step in your army where you're not having as many focal points. But for the Necrons, we definitely want to tackle that green glow in a way that's going to make it stand out. So in the Necron video, we go over exactly how we get this glow. But the secret, to the speed of army painting, especially if you're doing glowing paints, everything so far has not been done with an airbrush, including the bases. We just brushed everything on. But I highly recommend going through with an airbrush if you are going to be doing something like this. It is such a time saver, and it really helps with those gradients in making it actually appear like it's glowing. I have done several Necrons with just a brush without the airbrush, and it does turn out pretty well. There's no problems with that. Um, but the airbrush itself isn't as scary as you'd think, and it's a good tool for investment. Now, if you're kind of getting to this video and you're looking at it as, I just want to know how to paint Necrons really fast, I just want my army painted, I don't plan on painting a bunch of army projects, so I don't want to invest in an airbrush, I just want to get the paints that you told me to get, and that's it, I'm just going to use that to paint it. Fair enough. Just dry brush the white on in several layers, so where you get a brighter and brighter spot on some of these, and you'll get a really similar result. So if that's what you want to do to get the same effect, it will work really, really well. Because we did use a brush for the rest. All we did was, after we airbrushed on the white, we just went through with a brush and covered it in our green ink just to tint it, and that's going to keep a lot of it um, kind of whitish and desaturated, which is where the neon fluorescent yellow comes in. It's a transparent paint, so when you put it over the brightest spots, it's going to make it come across as green still, but it adds so much saturation from it trying to be yellow uh, that it really does just kick it up to that final notch that makes it just that bright green Necron glow that everyone loves. So just tackling that detail really finishes out this army in particular. We'll go over closing thoughts here while I show off some of the beauty shots of this army. And yeah, I really appreciate you watching so far, and we'll wrap it up here in a sec. Alright, thank you guys so much for making it to the end of the video. I know this one was a longer one, but when you're painting 2,000 points of Necrons and, giving your thoughts on army painting, it does take a little bit to go over everything that I think is worthwhile talking about. There's a lot of extra steps, tips, and tricks that I could make a whole other video on for army painting. Maybe it's a little bit more applicable to multiple other armies. I tried to give some other examples here other than Necrons, from my experience. But, I could definitely format another video, be a little bit more in depth on that. But that being said, this is the process. It's trying to think of the broad strokes of the army, how you can make it stand out while also saving a little bit of time. And I think that the Necrons are probably the fastest army I've ever painted to a good standard that also stands out as, is unique. I've painted Necrons before, but, that was really early on in my Warhammer career. So just being able to do it now with what I know makes a huge difference, and I'm hoping that watching this video and seeing just what is possible in a short amount of time will inspire you to be able to go out, paint your backlog, maybe get an army that you have been wanting to play or are playing but it's not painted, up to a good standard. It really does only take a weekend to get an army done depending on what you're painting. So long as you take the appropriate steps, you get the right tools, and you can make something that you're happy with. For me, I usually try to start with a gimmick. For the Necrons, it's chrome, um, and for the Imperial Fist, it's how they're weathered. Um, Night Lords, it's how the light is. So, find the main focal point of your army, something that you're excited about, passionate about. That'll really help you finish the army. Get the boring big step out of the way first, so that you can focus on the fun stuff. And it is a marathon. Uh, I wouldn't recommend doing it all in one day. I did mine over a weekend, so just several days with an easy paint scheme. If you have a bigger army with more detail, break it up into several weekends. But don't space it out too long, because I find the longer I'm away from a project, the harder it is to kind of come back without, its own unique sense of inspiration. Just tackling it somewhat efficiently for me has been the best way to go. So again, thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you got some, useful tips and tricks out of it, or maybe you just like seeing a Necron army come together. And you have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much.